Imagine a civilization at the height of its splendor. A dynasty whose cities shimmered like jewels along the winding rivers of ancient China, where lanterns glowed softly against the night sky and scholars wandered corridors lined with ink-stained scrolls, contemplating the universe itself. Sit back, relax, and let your mind drift to the year 618, when the Tang dynasty emerged from the ashes of a fractured empire, promising order, prosperity, and a cultural renaissance that would echo through centuries. From the very beginning, the Tamp's rulers sought to balance the raw power of the throne with the intricate mechanisms of governance, creating a system of administration so refined that it would guide China through generations, producing poetry, art, and technological advancements that still astound modern eyes. Yet, beneath the grandeur and the apparent serenity of court life, subtle tensions simmered. Regional governors grew ambitious, military commanders amassed personal loyalties, and foreign powers hovered on the borders, curious, cautious, sometimes predatory. The Tang Empire, though vast and magnificent, was like a delicate porcelain, vast, beautiful, intricate, yet vulnerable to even the slightest crack. Roads and canals connected the sprawling territory, allowing armies, merchants, and ideas to move with unprecedented speed. The Grand Canal became an artery of culture and commerce, carrying grain, silk, and news across thousands of miles, while bustling marketplaces in Chang'an and Luoyang offered a sensory feast of colors, scents, and sounds. Some researchers suggest that the dynasty's brilliance lay not only in its centralized authority but in its ability to weave together diversity. Nomadic warriors, settled farmers, scholars, and artisans all played roles in maintaining a fragile harmony. Others propose that this very complexity, this intricate web of interdependent systems, was a ticking clock, a silent countdown to instability that no emperor could halt. As we move forward through the centuries, you will witness how ambition, ideology, and circumstance converged to shape the destiny of the Tang dynasty, bringing it to dizzying heights and, eventually, to the shadows of decline. But before the first cracks appeared, before rebellions shook the foundations, the empire radiated a quiet confidence, as if it knew that, for a time at least, it had mastered the art of holding the world together. Yet, even in moments of triumph, whispers of unrest lingered just beyond the palace walls. And the question remained, how long could such brilliance endure in a world where power was never absolute, and loyalty was always fleeting? As the Tang dynasty matured, its cities became living tapestries of culture and ambition. Each street a corridor of human endeavor where merchants haggled over spices and silks. Scholars debated philosophy beneath ink-darkened eaves, and the air carried the mingled scents of incense, cooked rice, and damp river mist. Sit back and imagine the towering walls of Chang'an, the capital, its gates opening to a world where imperial authority projected both awe and subtle fear, where officials in flowing robes moved with precision, and courtiers whispered secrets that could change the fate of kingdoms. The empire's military was no mere afterthought. It was a force forged from centuries of experience, drawing on the skills of disciplined infantry, elite cavalry, and sometimes even mercenaries from distant steppes. Each soldier a thread in a fabric designed to bind an immense territory together. But the machinery of war was also the machinery of politics, for the Tang rulers relied heavily on regional commanders to enforce their will, to suppress unrest, and to collect taxes that fed the imperial treasury. This dependency sowed seeds of tension, subtle but persistent, as some commanders discovered the power inherent in autonomy, the seductive taste of ruling a region as if it were their own. Meanwhile, the people of the empire lived within a delicate balance of order and chaos. Farmers tilled fertile plains along the Yellow River, their labor feeding millions and sustaining the rhythm of the empire. Yet their lives could be disrupted in a single season by floods, droughts, or the march of armies. Scholars maintained libraries filled with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. But even these havens of knowledge were vulnerable to the unpredictable tides of rebellion or imperial neglect. Technology, too, flourished in the Tang period. Sophisticated ceramic kilns, bronze casting, and the development of woodblock printing allowed ideas, literature, and religious texts to move farther and faster than ever before. Some historians suggest that this era represented the pinnacle of pre-modern civilization, a rare moment when culture, commerce, and governance reached a harmonious peak, while others cautioned that beneath this veneer of perfection lay structural weaknesses, over-reliance on distant provincial authorities, and a fragile system of communication that could, and eventually would, fail. As we move to the next chapter of Tang history, you will see how these vulnerabilities, dormant yet potent, would awaken in unexpected ways, as ambition collided with ideology, and the empire's brilliance began to cast the first shadows of its own undoing. The question lingers: how does a dynasty so radiant, so meticulously organized, begin its slow descent into chaos, even while the lanterns still burn brightly along the city walls? By the mid-9th century, the Tang dynasty, despite its grandeur, faced fissures that were invisible to most but fatal in their consequence. Imagine the bustling streets of Chang'an subtly changing as imperial decrees grew slower, tax collection more irregular, and the voices of scholars and merchants increasingly drowned out by the clatter of armor and the hurried steps of provincial envoys. The empire's reliance on regional military commanders had evolved into a delicate, almost precarious, system of mutual dependence. These generals, once loyal instruments of imperial authority, began to see themselves as rulers in miniature, their armies like private kingdoms, their influence stretching across fertile valleys and winding rivers, far beyond the reach of the distant emperor. Some researchers believe this decentralization was manageable in times of peace, allowing local leaders to handle crises efficiently, while others suggest it created a hidden tinderbox, a situation where even minor sparks an unpaid troop, a slighted governor could ignite rebellion. The economic heartbeat of the empire, already complex, began faltering. Agricultural lands, once meticulously measured under the equal field system, fell into disarray as famines, floods, and population displacements disrupted centuries of careful planning. Salt monopolies and tax revenues, critical to maintaining both bureaucracy and army, shrank under local appropriation as regional powers claimed their own slices of wealth, often ignoring central commands. Meanwhile, the cultural and intellectual centers, so carefully nurtured over generations, suffered quietly. Libraries lost manuscripts, academies closed their doors, and skilled artisans abandoned imperial workshops, taking with them knowledge of advanced techniques in ceramics, silk weaving, and metallurgy. The empire's communication network, including the famed postal relay system, deteriorated as roads became unsafe and horses were requisitioned for local defense rather than message delivery. In the minds of ordinary citizens, the empire was still present in rituals, festivals, and formalities, yet the invisible threads of governance were fraying. The stage was set for revolt, for sudden upheaval, and for the emergence of figures who would challenge the old order with both ideology and violence. The rise of the Han Chaos Rebellion was not sudden. It was the inevitable eruption of pressures long building beneath the surface. As Wangshi and his followers gathered momentum, some viewed them as liberators, others as dangerous radicals. But whether hero or villain, their actions would plunge the empire into a conflict that revealed the fragility of even the most meticulously organized civilization. And as the first flames of rebellion licked the northern provinces, the question hung in the air. Could the Tang dynasty withstand a test not of enemies at its borders, but of its own structural weaknesses, stretched thin across a vast and diverse empire? The outbreak of the Han Chaos Rebellion in 874 AD tore through northern China like a storm that had been centuries in the making, revealing the vulnerabilities that had been quietly festering beneath Tang grandeur. Imagine the first bands of rebels moving with lightning speed across fertile plains and walled cities, their banners snapping in the wind, the clatter of hooves echoing across empty streets where bureaucrats once walked in measured steps. Wangshi, charismatic and ruthless, harnessed a revolutionary ideology that promised liberation and justice to those who had been crushed by taxes, forced labor, and the relentless demands of imperial control. Yet his forces were also untested in the prolonged demands of governance. Some historians suggest that his rapid success owed as much to Tang's administrative decay as to the brilliance of his strategy, while others argue that the fervor of his followers amplified small victories into seemingly unstoppable momentum. As rebel armies seized towns, imperial loyalists struggled to respond, hampered by fractured command and underfunded troops. Yet, even in victory, the rebels' weaknesses became apparent. They lacked experience in fortification, in maintaining supply lines, and in the subtle art of sustaining authority over conquered territories. Cities changed hands like pieces on a chessboard, burned in waves of chaotic conquest, leaving civilians trapped between plundering soldiers and collapsing infrastructure. Meanwhile, the Chachuo cavalry, renowned for their discipline and speed, moved with precision under the banners of loyalist generals, carving a path through rebel-held territories and slowly reclaiming northern provinces. Wangke's own demise in 884, at the hands of his nephew Chang'an during a desperate flight from pursuing forces, marked a decisive turning point, yet the rebellion's effects would linger far beyond his death. The once thriving agricultural regions lay in ruins, irrigation ditches, silted granaries looted, and the population dispersed by fear and famine. Economic networks, from salt and grain trade to long-distance Silk Road commerce, disintegrated under years of instability, leaving the imperial treasury hollow and the government dependent on regional military patrons for even the most basic survival. The intellectual and cultural losses were equally severe. Academies, libraries, and workshops, the lifeblood of Tang's scholarly and artistic life, were abandoned or destroyed, scattering the custodians of knowledge to distant and often inhospitable regions. By the time the rebellion ended, the empire's heart had been hollowed, leaving a vacuum that regional warlords would eagerly fill. The Tang dynasty survived in name, but its unity, authority, and control over the vast expanse of China had been irreversibly compromised. The question now became not whether the empire could survive, but whether it could ever reclaim the cohesive power that had once allowed it to command millions of people across mountains, rivers, and deserts, all under the illusion of a single, unbroken imperial will. As the smoke of rebellion cleared and northern cities smoldered under the remnants of chaos, A new order quietly took shape, one that the Tang emperors had long feared, yet never fully anticipated: the rise of regional warlords whose power rivaled the very throne they nominally served. Sit back, relax, and imagine a landscape where the lines of authority are no longer drawn by imperial edicts, but by the glint of a general's sword and the loyalty of tens of thousands of armed men. These military strongmen, once loyal commanders under Tamp's banners, now carved out territories that they ruled with independent authority, collecting taxes, administering justice, and raising armies without consulting the distant court in Chang'an. Some scholars suggest that this fragmentation was inevitable, the natural consequence of decades of reliance on provincial governors with semi-autonomous control, while others emphasize the catastrophic effects of the Han Chaos Rebellion, which shattered the infrastructure that had bound the empire together. Across the fertile plains of modern-day Hunan, Jiangsu, and Shanxi, former rebel leaders and loyalist generals alike consolidated their power, creating what might be called micro-kingdoms, each with its own military, administrative, and economic systems. Warlords like Zhuan, rising from the remnants of rebel factions, exemplified this transformation, demonstrating not only military skill, but also administrative savvy, building bureaucracies capable of sustaining their authority while competing with neighboring powers. The central government, weakened and impoverished, could offer little resistance, forced instead into a delicate dance of negotiation, tribute, and ceremonial acknowledgement of nominal imperial authority. Cities that had once symbolized Temp's unity now served as fortified strongholds, buzzing with the disciplined rhythms of militarized administration rather than the steady hum of civilian governance. In these fragmented domains, loyalty was transactional. Soldiers and officials answered first to those who could provide protection, pay, and opportunity, rather than to an emperor whose influence barely extended beyond the reconstructed capital walls. Economic recovery depended not on imperial policy, but on the capacity of each warlord to maintain local infrastructure, ensure agricultural production, and regulate trade. Cultural life, too, was localized, with scholars, artisans, and religious institutions now reliant on regional patrons rather than a unifying imperial system. From one territory to the next, legal codes, military practices, and even ceremonial customs diverged, creating a patchwork empire where the illusion of unity masked profound political and social fragmentation. And yet, despite the chaos, a strange resilience emerged. Regions stabilized under competent warlords, local populations adapted, and life, in some corners, resumed a semblance of normalcy. The Tang dynasty continued in name, but real power had shifted irrevocably, leaving observers to wonder how long any semblance of centralized authority could endure, and whether the ancient dream of a unified empire would ever rise from the ashes of rebellion. With the rise of autonomous warlords came the slow, inexorable collapse of the Temp's administrative system, a structure that had once bound the empire together with meticulous bureaucratic precision. Sit back, relax, and picture the grand halls of Chang'an, once filled with the quiet hum of clerks, scribes, and advisors, now echoing with emptiness. The ink-stained ledgers of centuries of governance scattered or destroyed. Archives lost, and legal precedents vanished. Provincial governors and county magistrates, once accountable to the emperor and central ministries, now answered to the nearest military commander whose authority was backed by force rather than law. The 3-chancellor and 6-ministry system, elegant on paper and flawless in theory, survived only as a ceremonial shadow of its former self, its ministers lacking both the resources and the reach to enforce imperial policy across the fractured empire. Scholars who had trained for decades to pass the imperial examinations found their institutions shuttered or redirected toward the immediate needs of local warlords, their libraries looted or abandoned, their pens silenced, and generations of knowledge scattered across the countryside. Some researchers suggest that this loss of institutional memory was more devastating than the physical destruction wrought by war, as the accumulated wisdom of centuries on taxation, agriculture, irrigation, law, and diplomacy was suddenly inaccessible to anyone attempting to govern. The phubbing system, which had long supplied the empire with disciplined farmer soldiers, disintegrated as rural populations fled conflict zones or were absorbed into local warlord militias, leaving the central government unable to field effective armies without depending on hired cavalry or foreign auxiliaries. Economic systems suffered in parallel. The equal field system, once the backbone of land distribution and tax collection, collapsed as cadastral records vanished and farming families were displaced or decimated. The salt monopoly, previously a major source of state revenue, yielded little as regional powers asserted their own levies, and imperial coins lost credibility, replaced by local minting or barter. Communication networks that had connected distant provinces fell into disrepair, cutting the imperial court off from the realities of its empire, while transportation routes like the Grand Canal became treacherous and unreliable. Despite these challenges, some pockets of administration persisted, often maintained by competent regional officials or ambitious warlords who recognized the practical value of governance. Yet even in these areas, continuity was fragile, and every administrative innovation faced the threat of disruption by conflict, natural disaster, or the whims of a militarized ruler. The Tang court in Chang'an, reduced to a few hundred officials, attempted to assert authority through ceremonies, symbolic appointments, and diplomatic correspondence. But these efforts barely masked the reality. The empire's veins had been severed, and centralized power had become an illusion. The stage was now set for a new era of political experimentation, one where military might, not bureaucratic tradition, determined who ruled and who survived. As the Temp's bureaucracy crumbled, the empire's economy and culture began to unravel in ways that few could have anticipated, creating a landscape both desolate and strangely vivid in its devastation. Sit back and imagine the once bustling markets of Chang'an and Luoyang, streets lined with merchants selling silk, ceramics, and spices, now reduced to quiet alleys where the occasional traveler passes beneath the skeletal remains of burned shopfronts, the scent of charred wood mingling with the distant, metallic tang of abandoned coinage. Agricultural lands, long meticulously managed under the equal field system, lay fallow as displaced peasants fled from bandits or the shifting fronts of regional militias. Irrigation canals choked with silt and debris, they're carefully engineered. Waterways now fractured, while rice paddies and wheat fields alternated with overgrown brush and the remnants of burned villages. Some scholars suggest that this collapse in productivity had ripple effects across every level of society. Tax revenues fell to a fraction of what had once sustained imperial ambitions. Famine became a recurring threat, and the flow of goods between north and south slowed to a trickle, as rivers clogged with debris and roads were no longer patrolled or maintained. Artisans and workshops that had produced Thames, porcelain, lacquerware, and intricate bronze tools dispersed. their knowledge carried into exile or lost entirely as families sought survival over craft. Silk production, once a cornerstone of both domestic prosperity and international prestige, declined sharply. Mulberry trees were abandoned or destroyed, looms fell silent, and weaving techniques faded with the displacement of skilled workers. Cultural transmission suffered equally. The Imperial Academy and private schools closed or operated under severe constraints, preventing the next generation from accessing classical learning, poetry, and philosophy that had been the lifeblood of Temp's intellectual life. Even within surviving urban centers, libraries had been plundered or burned, manuscripts lost, and historians who once chronicled dynastic decisions scattered across remote regions, struggling to reconstruct a past already partially erased. Meanwhile, natural disasters compounded human suffering. Floods along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers displaced tens of thousands, while damaged infrastructure made recovery slow and sporadic, leaving communities isolated and self-reliant in ways that further fractured cultural cohesion. Local customs and practices, once held together by imperial law and shared education, began to diverge. Each region adapted to survival, giving rise to a patchwork of social norms, dialects, and economic habits. From one ruin to the next, the Thames world appeared to dissolve into fragmented enclaves of resilience and desperation. A civilization still magnificent in memory, but fragmented in reality. And yet, within this chaos, some regions began to adapt, showing that even in collapse, human ingenuity and the pursuit of stability could endure. The next section will explore how regional warlords emerged not only as military powers, but as custodians of fragmented culture and administration, shaping the Tang legacy in unexpected ways. From the ashes of central authority, a new kind of power began to take shape, one that was neither fully imperial nor entirely chaotic, but a hybrid of military might and localized governance. Sit back and picture the sprawling northern plains and fertile river valleys where Temp's officials once exercised direct control, now dominated by regional commanders whose banners fluttered above walled towns and fortified camps, the clatter of armor and the neighing of horses replacing the rhythmic cadence of bureaucratic dispatches. These warlords, often former generals or loyalists who had survived the rebellion, commanded armies that were as much instruments of administration as they were tools of conquest, their influence extending into taxation, judicial authority, and the allocation of land. Some researchers argue that the rise of these autonomous powers was inevitable once the central court lost the ability to enforce its will. Others suggest that it was a deliberate choice by regional leaders to consolidate control. In response to the vacuum left by rebellion and fiscal collapse, in regions like modern-day Henan, the Zhuan faction exemplified this transformation, blending the organizational skills of the Tang military with the administrative structures needed to govern civilian populations. Marketplaces reopened under their protection, local records were reconstructed, and agricultural production cautiously resumed, though always under the watchful eye of soldiers whose loyalty was tied to immediate reward rather than imperial ideology. The balance of power was precarious. Alliances shifted as commanders negotiated, bribed, or threatened neighbors, while local elites navigated a labyrinth of obligations to both their immediate rulers and the distant symbolic authority of the emperor. This autonomy extended to legal and cultural spheres as well. Laws were enforced according to local custom rather than imperial code. Festivals and rituals adapted to regional identity, and scholarly activity persisted sporadically where conditions allowed, often supported by the patronage of warlords seeking to legitimize their rule. Yet beneath this veneer of order lay a constant undercurrent of tension and uncertainty. Armies could be withdrawn, crops destroyed, or rivals invade at a moment's notice, making the stability of these semi-independent regions fragile and fleeting. Still, the very existence of these warlord-led territories preserved elements of Tang civilization that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Libraries were protected, artisans employed, and records maintained, creating pockets of continuity amid widespread decay. And as the young Emperor Shaozong attempted to navigate this landscape of fragmented authority, he confronted the stark reality that nominal imperial power was now dependent on negotiation and concession rather than command. The story of these regional powers raises a haunting question. In a world where loyalty is bought and borders are fluid, can culture and governance survive without central authority, or does survival demand its own ruthless reinvention? Next, we move to the intricate dance of diplomacy, rebellion, and restoration that defined Shaozong's early reign, a period where every decision carried the weight of a collapsing empire. As Emperor Shaozong assumed the throne, the Tang Empire he inherited was a shadow of its former grandeur, a realm of fractured provinces, autonomous military powers, and devastated populations. Yet even in this landscape of ruin, he faced the immense task of restoration with a mixture of caution and ambition. Imagine the rebuilt capital of Chang'an, its streets narrower, its grand avenues scarred by fire and abandonment, the echo of once ceaseless crowds, now replaced by the creaking of wooden carts and the distant clamor of soldiers drilling in makeshift training grounds. Shaozong understood that the key to restoring authority lay not merely in military action, but in the delicate art of diplomacy, the weaving of alliances, and the careful management of powerful regional commanders who had tasted independence and were reluctant to surrender it. Some historians suggest he viewed these warlords as both a threat and a lifeline, necessary partners in stabilizing a realm that could no longer rely on centralized force alone. To negotiate with them, the emperor offered political concessions, trade privileges, and ceremonial recognition, while subtly reinforcing his own authority through symbolic acts of ritual and administrative appointments. Yet, even as he extended olive branches, Shaozong also sought to rebuild imperial military capacity, establishing small, loyal units drawn from regions still under direct governmental control, training officers in the principles of allegiance to the throne rather than local power, and attempting to revive recruitment, procedures that could sustain a professional army in the absence of the phubbing system that had once formed the backbone of Tang military strength. The balance was delicate. Insufficient force risked defiance and rebellion, while excessive pressure could drive warlords to open conflict. Amid these political maneuvers, the emperor confronted the harsh reality of demographic collapse, a countryside ravaged by flood, famine, and displacement, where farming populations were reduced, irrigation systems neglected, and the equitably distributed lands of the equal field system lay in disarray. Urban centers that had once been hubs of trade and culture struggled to provide basic services, while trade networks, both domestic and along the Silk Road, faltered under the shadow of regional taxation and fragmented authority. Yet even in this environment of scarcity and uncertainty, Shaozong's administration sought to preserve culture and governance, attempting to rebuild schools, revive the examination system, and train a new generation of bureaucrats, though always constrained by the limited reach of imperial power and the pressing needs of survival. His efforts illustrate the tension between ambition and reality, the eternal challenge of restoring order in a world that had learned to thrive in disorder. As we turn the page to the next chapter, we witness the collision of political idealism and pragmatic compromise, where every decision, every alliance, and every military deployment would shape the final fate of the Tang legacy and hint at the forces that would ultimately extinguish its centuries-long flame. The challenges facing Emperor Xiaozong extended far beyond politics and military organization, reaching deep into the economic lifeblood of the empire, a web of commerce, agriculture, and taxation that had been systematically torn apart by decades of rebellion and neglect. Sit back and imagine the fields along the Yellow River, once vibrant with the green of rice paddies and wheat, now scarred by floodwaters and abandoned plots, the wooden gates of farmhouses hanging askew, livestock diminished, and irrigation canals clogged with debris. The Grand Canal, lifeline of grain transport, had deteriorated in both structure and function, its waters muddied and shallow, preventing the steady movement of supplies from southern granaries to the northern capitals. Meanwhile, local military governors, emboldened by autonomy, imposed their own taxes, collected tribute for their private coffers, and diverted resources for personal armies, leaving imperial coffers empty and fiscal recovery seemingly impossible. Some scholars argue that this economic fragmentation forced Xiaozong to innovate, introducing localized initiatives that encouraged cultivation and trade, offering temporary exemptions from taxation to incentivize farming, and attempting to re-establish currency trust by regulating the minting of coins and controlling debasement. Yet even these measures were fragile, dependent on local compliance and the unpredictable loyalty of regional powers who viewed imperial decrees with suspicion. The collapse of the equal field system compounded the crisis, as land allocation had once guaranteed both productivity and a stable tax base. Now, ad hoc arrangements and the seizure of estates by military strongmen disrupted centuries of agricultural planning. Cities struggled to recover. Marketplaces were sparsely populated, craftsmen had dispersed or abandoned their trades, and commercial networks that had connected distant regions fractured into isolated pockets of exchange. Silk production, ceramics, and other artisanal industries that had symbolized Temp's sophistication and wealth fell into decline, not merely from lost labor but also from the destruction of infrastructure and disruption of supply chains. Barter increasingly replaced coinage, reducing economic efficiency, while trade along the Silk Road waned under the combined weight of insecurity, autonomous tariffs, and the absence of central coordination. The emperor's attempts to reassert control over these systems often resulted in temporary gains rather than lasting stability, highlighting the profound limitations of imperial authority in a landscape dominated by local autonomy and military might. And yet, amidst this economic devastation, Xiaozong persevered, recognizing that without some revival of production, commerce, and revenue, both cultural restoration and military reform would falter. As we move next into the realm of cultural and intellectual life, we encounter a Temp's world struggling to maintain its heritage, where knowledge, artistry, and tradition teetered on the edge of disappearance, threatened by war, displacement, and the slow erosion of imperial oversight. As the Tang's empire grappled with economic disarray, its cultural and intellectual foundations teetered precariously, threatened by the very chaos that had engulfed politics and agriculture. Sit back and picture the grand halls of the Imperial Academy, once bustling with scholars meticulously copying texts, debating Confucian philosophy, and training the administrators who would govern an empire of hundreds of millions. Now, many of these halls stood empty or had been repurposed as barracks or storage for military supplies, their libraries stripped, manuscripts lost or burned, and the air thick with the dust of neglect. Some researchers suggest that the dispersal of scholars to distant provinces created pockets of knowledge, small islands of learning clinging to survival amidst widespread destruction, while others argue that the loss was more absolute, eroding centuries of accumulated wisdom in administration, history, and science. Private academies, reliant on aristocratic patronage, largely disappeared as their benefactors fled, were killed, or lost their fortunes, leaving aspiring students with no formal guidance, and entire generations growing up without access to classical education. Historical record-keeping suffered irreparably. Court historians who had meticulously chronicled dynastic affairs scattered, forced to rely on fragmented memories and surviving scraps of documents, leading to gaps in the understanding of both past and present events. Artisan knowledge, too, faced similar threats. The workshops producing sophisticated weaponry, porcelain, and silk fell into disrepair or were abandoned entirely, dispersing master craftsmen whose expertise was impossible to replicate quickly, leaving cities and courts bereft of the goods and technologies that once symbolized Tang's sophistication. Even everyday practices, from irrigation techniques to local rituals, were disrupted as social networks fractured, families displaced, and rural communities struggled to survive amidst lingering insecurity. Some regions retained fragments of intellectual life, with local leaders investing in scholars or maintaining libraries for prestige and administrative utility. But these efforts were scattered and inconsistent, insufficient to restore empire-wide coherence. Religious institutions, often intertwined with education, provided some continuity, but even monasteries and temples suffered looting and population decline, further weakening networks of learning. And so, the empire that had once celebrated poetry, painting, calligraphy, and scientific innovation now faced a slow erosion of knowledge, a quiet unraveling that mirrored the collapse of centralized authority. Yet even in this shadow, seeds of resilience remained, as small groups of scholars, artisans, and teachers carried the fragile torch of Tang culture into the uncertain decades ahead. From one mystery to the next, we now turn to the reconstruction of military power, where Emperor Xiaozong attempted to navigate an empire dominated not by court edicts, but by autonomous regional armies whose loyalties were often as mercurial as the fortunes of the state itself. With the temps, empire's intellectual and cultural heart weakened. The question of military survival became paramount, and it is here that the story takes a darker, more calculated turn. Sit back and imagine the vast plains and river valleys of northern China, where armies once marched in disciplined formations, now punctuated by autonomous warlords, each commanding their own soldiers, collecting taxes independently, and wielding power that rivaled even the emperor's nominal authority. The old phubbing system, which had transformed peasant farmers into soldier farmers loyal to the state, had disintegrated completely, leaving the empire dependent on professional soldiers whose maintenance strained the depleted treasury. Emperor Xiaozong, acutely aware of these limitations, sought to rebuild military capacity, attempting to establish units loyal not to regional commanders but directly to the crown. Some sources suggest he recruited from areas still under imperial control, focusing on young men whose families had remained tied to the central state, while others imply that desperation led him to accept foreign auxiliaries, most notably Turcic cavalry, whose discipline and skill in horseback warfare offered unmatched tactical advantage but came at the cost of extreme political dependence and financial burden. These chateau cavalry, numbering in the tens of thousands, could strike with speed and precision across the fractured northern territories, their hooves echoing through the open plains like thunder, announcing the return of imperial ambition. Yet their loyalty was never absolute, tethered only by payment and promises that the weakened treasury could scarcely guarantee. At the same time, regional military commanders such as Juan and Yang Shengmi solidified their autonomy, administering territories with sophisticated bureaucracies that often outperformed the imperial center in efficiency and local control. They collected taxes, adjudicated disputes, and conducted diplomacy, all while maintaining the illusion of Tang subordination through ceremonial tribute, a thin veil over the reality of fragmented sovereignty. Xiaozong's attempts at military reform were constrained by these realities, his armies outnumbered and out-resourced by entrenched regional powers. Yet his efforts demonstrated a recognition that without loyal forces, the central government was a ghost, its commands echoing in empty corridors. Natural disasters compounded these challenges. Floods along the Yellow River devastated agricultural output, displacing populations who might have supplied both soldiers and taxes, while the Grand Canal, lifeblood of imperial logistics, fell into disrepair, further hampering troop movement and grain transport from one precarious military endeavor to the next. The emperor's court navigated a labyrinth of negotiations, coercion, and fragile alliances, revealing an empire in which centralized authority had become an aspirational concept, suspended over a landscape dominated by autonomous power, awaiting the next twist in the Tang saga. As Emperor Xiaozong struggled to consolidate his authority, the intricate web of regional power revealed just how far the Tang dynasty had fractured, and the story becomes a tale of shifting loyalties, silent betrayals, and the subtle art of political survival. Picture the sprawling cities and river valleys of the empire, once vibrant with commerce and scholarship, now a patchwork of semi-independent territories, each governed by military commanders whose ambitions often eclipsed any allegiance to the throne. The emperor's letters and envoys traversed dangerous roads, constantly at risk of interception by forces whose priorities lay in their own wealth and security. Some historians suggest Xiaozong sought to exploit rivalries between these commanders, attempting to pit one against another through carefully measured concessions, while others argue that the emperor's court was too small and under-resourced to implement any meaningful strategy, leaving him dependent on the goodwill or fear of men who commanded the empire's real power. Even the loyal chateau cavalry, with their disciplined formations and unmatched horsemanship, could not operate independently of regional support, their campaigns requiring safe passage, supply lines, and local cooperation that were not guaranteed in a fragmented landscape. In the countryside, displaced farmers and refugees created a restless undercurrent, their labor essential to rebuilding both armies and the economy. Yet their mistrust and resentment toward imperial authorities complicated recruitment and tax collection. Administrative reforms aimed at restoring the examination system offered some hope, but the scale of devastation meant that trained bureaucrats were few, and new institutions struggled to gain credibility amidst the chaos. Meanwhile, autonomous governors developed self-sufficient systems, maintaining local law, trade, and agriculture, often creating wealth and stability within their regions that the central government could not match. Trade networks, once flowing with silk, salt, and grain, were rerouted or cut entirely, as commanders imposed their own tariffs and local regulations, fragmenting markets that had previously connected the empire's vast territories. The tension between centralized authority and regional independence became a defining feature of late Tang's politics, and every imperial decree risked being ignored, manipulated, or appropriated for local benefit. Xiaozong's court, operating in temporary buildings in a partially restored Chang'an, became a theater of fragile negotiation, where every appointment, every military order, and every diplomatic overture had to be weighed against the potential for rebellion or opportunism. Even within the palace, influence was concentrated in the hands of court eunuchs and advisors whose power often rivaled the emperor himself, shaping policy, directing funds, and sometimes secretly negotiating with the very commanders whose loyalty was uncertain. In this delicate balance, the Tang dynasty's survival depended less on divine mandate or cultural prestige and more on a constant, invisible struggle of strategy, persuasion, and force, a precarious dance that would determine whether the central government could ever rise. Above the shadows cast by its own disintegration, the shadow of rebellion lingered over the Tang Empire, and as we move deeper into this era of political fragmentation, it becomes clear that the very essence of imperial power had shifted from ceremonial grandeur to practical control over resources and loyalty. Imagine Chang'an, the reconstructed capital, its grand palaces half restored, courtyards echoing with the footsteps of a few hundred officials, the scent of incense lingering in halls that once hosted thousands, and the air thick with uncertainty. The emperor, though adorned in resplendent robes, wielded authority that was largely symbolic, a thin veneer over the true power now concentrated in regional commanders who controlled armies, food supplies, and fortified cities. Some researchers suggest that the emperor's dependence on chateau cavalry and other mercenary forces created a paradox. These troops were essential for defense, yet their loyalty was transactional, bound by pay and privilege rather than allegiance to the dynasty, while Xiaozong attempted to implement reforms to strengthen central authority. Regional rulers often interpreted these measures as opportunities to extract further concessions, cement their autonomy, and expand their influence. Administrative reconstruction proceeded slowly. The examination system revived only in part, targeting practical governance rather than literary achievement, but the pool of qualified candidates remained limited, scattered, and cautious. Beyond the palace walls, the empire's economy struggled to regain cohesion. Flooded river valleys, destroyed irrigation systems, and abandoned farmlands reduced agricultural output, creating scarcity and unrest. Trade, once the lifeblood of Tang's prosperity, was fragmented as local military governors imposed tariffs, controlled river passages, and restricted caravan routes to protect their own revenue streams. Artisans, displaced and dispersed, struggled to maintain techniques in pottery, silk weaving, and bronze work, while markets for luxury goods dwindled, leaving cultural production diminished and localized. Within this landscape of scarcity and fragmented authority, the emperor's envoys and court officials had to navigate a delicate web of alliances, rivalries, and subtle threats, where a single misstep could provoke rebellion or alienate a key ally. Diplomacy became a matter of survival, as Xiaozong attempted to exploit fractures among his nominal subordinates, offering trade privileges, tax concessions, and ceremonial recognition in hopes of creating temporary coalitions of support. Yet these arrangements were often fleeting, dissolving as soon as local interests shifted or a stronger military presence threatened to disrupt the fragile balance. In this uncertain world, the Tang court struggles were not merely political but existential. Every decree, every tax collection, every military maneuver carried the weight of preserving a dynasty that had once ruled an empire of staggering cultural and geographic breadth, now reduced to a fragile heart struggling to maintain pulse amidst the chaos of divided lands. As night fell over Chang'an and distant garrisons echoed with the clatter of sentries and the murmurs of anxious commanders, one question hung over the empire: could centralized authority ever reassert itself? Or had the age of independent warlords sealed the Tang's fate? As we continue our journey through the unraveling Temp's empire, it becomes evident that the shifting balance of power was mirrored in every aspect of daily life, from bustling urban centers to remote villages along the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. Cities that had once thrived as hubs of commerce, education, and artistry now bore the scars of repeated warfare, with crumbling walls, abandoned markets, and silent temples where incense no longer rose into the sky. Some historians suggest that the psychological impact of this prolonged instability was profound. Citizens accustomed to imperial protection and predictable administration were forced to navigate a landscape dominated by local military strongmen, each with their own laws, taxes, and expectations of loyalty. In rural areas, the collapse of the equal field system compounded hardships, as farmers struggled to claim or retain land amid ongoing population displacement and marauding forces. Irrigation channels, once meticulously maintained to feed millions, fell into disrepair or were deliberately sabotaged during skirmishes, reducing yields and exacerbating famine. Silk and ceramic production, the hallmarks of Tang's cultural influence, suffered similarly as artisans either fled the chaos or were co-opted by regional powers to serve local tastes rather than imperial demand. Meanwhile, communication across the empire became increasingly perilous. The postal relay system, once a marvel of efficiency, had largely ceased to function. Riders and couriers faced the dual threats of bandits and the capricious whims of local military governors who frequently seized horses, supplies, and messages for their own purposes. As a result, information that once flowed freely between court and provinces slowed to a trickle, leaving governors and commanders to act autonomously, often unaware of broader imperial strategies or policies. In Chang'an, the emperor and his court found themselves trapped within the palace complex, reliant on a network of loyal eunuchs, advisors, and foreign mercenaries to maintain order while attempting to negotiate with semi-independent warlords. Xiaozong's initiatives to train loyal troops and restore administrative schools were met with mixed success. Constrained by limited funds, manpower shortages, and the entrenched authority of regional rulers, diplomacy became a delicate art of compromise and coercion. As temporary alliances were formed and dissolved with the shifting tides of military strength. Through all this, the empire's cultural and intellectual heart continued to bleed. Libraries and archives destroyed during the An Lashan rebellion were rarely restored, and the next generation of scholars faced an environment where classical learning was fragmented and survival took precedence over study. In this fragile equilibrium of authority, economy, and culture, the Tang dynasty teetered on the edge of historical oblivion, raising a haunting question for historians and observers alike. How long could an empire, once vast and unified, endure when its lifeblood, both human and institutional, had been so thoroughly dispersed? As we move deeper into the twilight of the Tang dynasty, the fragile threads of imperial authority became almost invisible. A ghostly framework barely holding together amidst the chaos of fragmented power. Regional military commanders, once loyal subordinates, now acted as independent rulers, issuing orders, collecting taxes, and commanding armies without deference to the central court. Some researchers suggest that these warlords were more than opportunists. They were the embodiment of a political system that had evolved under duress, adapting to a reality in which survival depended on autonomy and immediate control rather than loyalty to distant, weakened authority. Chang'an, once the bustling heart of an empire that stretched from the steppes to the southern seas, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, its population decimated, streets half empty, and imperial palaces in ruins. Emperor Shaozong and his successors operated within this hollowed court, their decisions constrained by the necessity to placate those who held the true power, the generals and governors of the regions, each with their own ambitions and armed forces. The economic landscape mirrored this political disintegration. The equal field system, once a cornerstone of agricultural organization and taxation, had collapsed entirely, leaving farmers vulnerable to inconsistent local taxation and the unpredictable ravages of war. The Grand Canal, vital for moving grain and sustaining urban populations, suffered from neglect and damage, reducing the flow of essential supplies and further weakening the empire's cohesion. Beyond economics, the cultural and intellectual fabric of Tang society began to fray. Schools that had trained bureaucrats in Confucian ideals, libraries that preserved centuries of accumulated knowledge, and scholarly networks that facilitated discourse across the empire all diminished or vanished entirely. Private academies closed as patronage disappeared, and the scattering of learned families created a brain drain that echoed through generations, severing the link between past traditions and future governance. Technological and artisanal skills, once concentrated in imperial workshops, dispersed into pockets controlled by local authorities or vanished entirely as communities fled the violence or struggled to survive. Even communication networks, which had once allowed the empire to operate with remarkable cohesion over vast distances, broke down entirely, leaving regions isolated and increasingly self-reliant. In this fragmented world, the notion of a unified Tang dynasty existed only in ceremony and memory, a fragile illusion that masked the reality of decentralized power and regional autonomy. And yet, amidst this decay, the question lingers: could a once mighty empire, fractured and bleeding from decades of rebellion and mismanagement, find the resilience to endure? Was the end inevitable, written into the very structure of its decline? By the late 880s and early 890s, the Tang dynasty's decay had reached a point where the imperial court, once the unquestioned center of political and cultural authority, became a shadowy observer of its own disintegration. Emperor Shaozong, young but aware of the fragility surrounding him, attempted reforms, rebuilding what little centralized authority remained while negotiating carefully with regional powers, whose armies outmatched anything the court could muster. Some historians suggest that Shaozong's efforts were akin to patching a crumbling dam. With paper, no matter how meticulous the plans, the pressures of fractured loyalty, depleted resources, and decades of war made lasting success nearly impossible. The Chateau cavalry, composed of tens of thousands of highly skilled Turek horsemen, represented the closest the emperor had to a reliable military force, but their loyalty came at a cost, both financial and political. and their presence reminded the court daily of its dependence on external power. At the same time, regional warlords consolidated their influence, establishing independent administrations that functioned with efficiency, often surpassing the weakened imperial government. In Henan province, Chang'an controlled territory with a sophistication of governance that rivaled Chang'an itself, collecting taxes, maintaining armies, and negotiating diplomatic arrangements with neighbors as if the empire were a distant concept. Meanwhile, natural disasters compounded the political and military crises. Devastating floods along the Yellow River in 889 AD displaced hundreds of thousands, destroyed irrigation systems, and crippled agricultural output, leaving famine and social unrest in its wake. Trade networks, once the arteries of the empire, fell into disrepair, leaving urban centers underpopulated and markets destabilized. Silk, ceramics, and other luxury industries, hallmarks of Tang's prosperity, collapsed as artisans fled, workshops were destroyed, and raw materials became scarce. The once vibrant intellectual and cultural life of the empire waned alongside these economic and administrative failures. The imperial academy and private schools that had cultivated generations of civil servants ceased to function effectively, leaving younger generations without access to the classical learning that had sustained governance and cultural continuity for centuries. Knowledge, tradition, and technique fragmented alongside political power, scattering into isolated pockets controlled by autonomous regions or lost entirely. In this precarious environment, the question arises: how long could the Tang dynasty survive when its rulers were confined to ceremonial authority, its institutions hollowed out, and its people dispersed, impoverished and disillusioned? The answer would come violently, and soon, as ambition and desperation collided in a final act that would forever alter the landscape of Chinese history. The year 904 AD marked a turning point that many historians describe as the final unraveling of Tang authority, a moment when the delicate balance between ceremonial power and military reality shattered entirely. Emperor Shaozong, despite years of careful negotiation, reform attempts, and reliance on loyal forces, found himself trapped within a court increasingly dominated by palace eunuchs and ambitious military commanders whose influence eclipsed the imperial throne. Among these power brokers, Chang'an emerged as the most formidable, a warlord whose strategic acumen and ruthless ambition allowed him to manipulate both the court and the fragmented regional authorities to his advantage. On a humid August day, soldiers acting under Chang'an's orders stormed the imperial residence, and the emperor, once a symbol of centuries of continuity, was assassinated. The sound of steel and the chaos of palace corridors echoed the collapse of authority, a final, violent punctuation to nearly a century of declining imperial control. Some accounts suggest the emperor resisted, others that he was trapped, isolated, and powerless. But the outcome was the same. The Tang dynasty's central figure, the human embodiment of legitimacy, was gone. In the aftermath, Chang'an moved quickly, installing the young 13-year-old son of the deceased emperor as a puppet ruler, a calculated performance of legitimacy while consolidating real power in his own hands. The palace, once a center of ceremonial grandeur, now became a stage for political theater, where traditional rites masked the practical reality. The emperor had no independence, no military authority, and no resources beyond what Chang'an permitted. Across the empire, regional military commanders observed the unfolding events with a mixture of opportunism and caution, recognizing that the central government's fragility allowed them to maintain autonomy while asserting influence over local governance and taxation. Scholars and administrators, already scattered by decades of warfare and administrative collapse, struggled to navigate the new political landscape, where loyalty was transactional and competence often secondary to survival. The economic consequences of this upheaval were profound. Imperial tax revenues, already diminished by earlier rebellions and the collapse of the equal field system, were now further undermined as warlords redirected resources to support their own forces, leaving trade networks disrupted and local economies dependent on military patronage. The cultural continuity of the Tang era suffered similarly. Libraries, academies, and artisan communities that had thrived under centuries of centralized support faced abandonment, destruction, or absorption into regional patronage networks. In this climate of uncertainty and transformation, one question loomed large. Could any semblance of centralized governance survive in a landscape dominated by autonomous warlords, each guarding their own territories, armies, and ambitions? The answer, as the story would reveal, lay not in negotiation or reform, but in the emergence of a new dynasty forged from the ashes of chaos, where the remnants of imperial grandeur would be repurposed, reshaped, and ultimately redefined. The abdication of Emperor I in 907 AD marked the official end of the Tang Dynasty, an event as ceremonious as it was tragic, signaling the collapse of nearly 3 centuries of imperial authority that had shaped Chinese civilization in ways both subtle and profound. Chang'an, now unchallenged in his control of the northern heartlands, assumed the mantle of power, founding what historians would later call the later Liang dynasty, the first of the 5 dynasties that would dominate northern China in the coming decades. Yet the transition was less a restoration of order than the formalization of fragmentation. The young emperor's abdication was a ritual, a spectacle that preserved the illusion of legitimacy, while reality had shifted decisively to military rule. Across the former empire, regional commanders who had grown accustomed to autonomy observed these changes with keen interest, some consolidating power further, others negotiating temporary allegiances with the new regime, but all aware that the central authority they once deferred to no longer dictated the terms of governance. The empire's southern regions, far from the later Liang capital, continued to operate as independent kingdoms, each with its own administrative systems, tax collection, and military forces, while trade, culture, and diplomacy adapted to the fragmented political landscape. In this environment, the Tang dynasty's cultural and intellectual legacies became both a reminder of what was lost and a tool for new rulers, who sought to draw legitimacy from association with the venerable dynasty even as they pursued their own ambitions. The collapse of the Tamps also underscored the enduring tension between central authority and local power, recurring theme in Chinese history, revealing how the fragility of imperial institutions could be exploited by those with military strength and political cunning. Economically, the empire suffered further dislocation as regional lords imposed their own taxation and regulatory systems, disrupting trade networks and creating localized economies that sometimes thrived in isolation, sometimes stagnated under the weight of warlord predation. Cities that had once pulsed with temps, prosperity experienced decline, depopulation, or transformation, while agricultural regions struggled to maintain productivity amid inconsistent governance and lingering social unrest. Cultural continuity, too, faced challenges. The collapse of centralized examination systems, patronage networks, and scholarly institutions meant that education and bureaucratic training became regionally fragmented, producing localized traditions of administration and learning that differed markedly from Tang-era standards. Yet despite the political chaos, the memory of Tang achievements in poetry, art, architecture, and governance persisted, shaping the aspirations of both rulers and scholars in the ensuing centuries. The question that lingered over northern China in the wake of Tang's fall was both practical and existential. Could any future dynasty unify these fractured lands? Or had the age of regionalism, warlordism, and fragmented authority become the defining reality of Chinese political life? The answer would unfold slowly through decades of conflict, negotiation, and consolidation, setting the stage for a new era of dynastic experimentation and the eventual rise of the Song dynasty as the later Liang dynasty settled into power. The once mighty Thames territories were transformed into a patchwork of competing regions, each ruled by military strongmen whose ambitions often outpaced their capacity for sustainable governance. In the north, Zhuan's authority over the former Tang heartlands was constantly tested by rival generals and local warlords, each controlling their own armies, collecting taxes independently, and maintaining diplomatic channels with neighbors, foreign traders, and even distant southern kingdoms. These fractured territories developed distinct identities, shaped as much by geography and local culture as by political leadership, creating a mosaic of semi-autonomous domains that sometimes cooperated, often clashed, and always pursued Central China's once imposing administrative apparatus, the 3 chancellors and 6 ministries that had long maintained imperial cohesion, now existed in name only, a ceremonial relic beneath, which real power was exercised by whoever commanded the most disciplined troops or controlled the wealthiest region. In this environment, the mechanisms that had sustained Tang-era civilization, postal relay systems, examination-based bureaucracy, and centralized tax collection were either co-opted by regional rulers or left to decay entirely. Scholars, artisans, and administrators were dispersed, their talents drawn into service by local powers or lost to obscurity, and the cultural coherence that had flourished under Tang patronage became increasingly fragile. Urban centers, once hubs of commerce and intellectual activity, faced depopulation and economic stagnation as regional taxes, inconsistent protection, and the disruption of trade discouraged merchants and artisans from remaining. The rural landscape, too, bore the scars of centuries of rebellion, famine, and warfare. Irrigation systems and fields, vital to sustaining population and empire alike, were neglected or destroyed, leaving agriculture vulnerable to environmental fluctuations and further weakening the political foundations necessary for central authority. Amid this backdrop of decay, some regions achieved remarkable pockets of stability, often through the administrative skill or strategic acumen of their rulers, rather than imperial oversight. In Henan, the former stronghold of Zhuan's forces, efficient governance, tax collection, and military organization allowed for relative prosperity, demonstrating that localized power, if exercised wisely, could achieve what the weakened central government no longer could. Yet even these successes were fragile, dependent on the continuous presence and competence of individual leaders. A reminder that the Tang dynasty's collapse had not just ended a ruling house, but had destabilized the very structures that had allowed empire-wide coherence. As the 5 dynasties period continued, this delicate balance of power, loyalty, and military capability would define the political landscape of northern China, leaving historians to ponder the paradox of a civilization simultaneously resilient and fragmented, culturally vibrant yet politically disunited, forever shaped by the shadow of the Tang's fall. The question remained, could any ruler ever reforge the shattered unity of the empire, or had the age of fragmentation become the new normal? Finally, as we arrive at the last echoes of Tang authority, the story of this dynasty's rise and fall becomes a meditation on the fragile balance between centralized power and regional autonomy, between cultural brilliance and political fragility. The Tang dynasty, for nearly 3 centuries, had managed to weave together a vast and diverse empire, binding distant regions through shared institutions, trade networks, and cultural practices. Yet even its achievements could not withstand the compounded pressures of rebellion, administrative decay, and environmental disasters. The An Lashong Rebellion, which had seemed a temporary rupture at first, unleashed forces that reshaped the very structure of Chinese governance, setting the stage for the warlord era, the later dynasties of the north, and the eventual fragmentation that defined the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. What remains striking, even now, is the paradoxical legacy of the Tang. It was a civilization capable of producing monumental art, poetry that transcended time, architecture that rivaled the imagination, and systems of administration and examination that would influence centuries of governance. Yet it was also vulnerable to the human flaws of ambition, greed, and the challenges of maintaining control over vast territories and diverse populations. The fall of the Tents invites reflection on how empires endure and how they crumble, often not through sudden catastrophe alone, but through slow, inexorable processes: military overreach, bureaucratic corruption, economic strain, and the gradual empowerment of local authorities at the expense of central unity. And yet, even as political cohesion dissolved, the cultural achievements of the Tang period continued to ripple outward, influencing subsequent dynasties and leaving an indelible mark on Chinese civilization that persists to this day. Imagine the streets of Chang'an, once the beating heart of an empire, silent and scarred by conflict. The marketplaces empty, libraries burned, and yet the poetry of Li Bai and Du Fu echoing through the corridors of time. A testament to human creativity surviving beyond political collapse. The Tang dynasty's story, then, is not simply one of loss and fragmentation, but also of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring power of culture to outlast the fragile apparatus of empire. As we close this chapter, sit back and let the echoes of 1,000 years of history settle. The rise and fall of emperors, generals, and scholars blending into the quiet rhythm of a civilization that, though fractured, still whispers across the centuries. What lessons linger in the ruins of the Tang, and what echoes might they cast on the civilizations that followed? The answers remain as tantalizingly just out of reach as the imperial gates of Chang'an, waiting for those willing to listen to the faint, persistent hum of history.